Who made us? God made us. Who is God? You dress in this little bride suit in the 2nd grade, and you go through all your sins. You make your first Holy Communion and become the bride of Christ. Being raised as a Catholic, 2 things were really, really good. Dying was one of them, and self-mutilation was another one. Because the saints would lay on horsehair and beat themselves and slice themselves and do all these things that were considered very spiritual and very... You'd get time off of purgatory for suffering more on this earth. You were such a bad person. You were always a sinner. You were always on the verge of going to hell. One of the places you could go when you died was limbo. And the reason I wanted to go there was because God wasn't there. And the nuns were quite violent too. I remember being hit and clubbed. And so I was shaking all the time. And I flunked 1st grade. And they told us about these saints that their hands would open up and start bleeding just like Jesus, and their feet would bleed, and a lot of us would cut ourselves secretly, little nicks in our hands, little razor blade cuts, sticking ourselves with a little nail. We wouldn't tell the nuns, but we'd all do it. And I just started slicing up my arms and burning myself, and I think I'd learned a lot of that behavior, not only from Catholic school, but I learned it in the psych ward. We'd share our suicide stories on how to kill ourselves. I always felt I was connected in this web that was like a nightmare, that I was a part of my mother, that I would never get away alive. I never saw myself as breaking away, growing up, any of that. I saw myself as being killed. We had guns in the house. I had guns pointed at me. I was picked up and thrown through windows. I was battered against the wall. You know, I saw my mother's face bashed in. I can remember one time being in a crib and having a babysitter just batter me with a hairbrush. I think the image that used to scare me was a gun getting pointed at my head.
When I was 28 years old, I suffered from depression, so I committed myself to a hospital. My husband took me to the ward, which was called the locked ward. There he left me and went home to take care of the children, and there I went inside, and the door was slammed and locked.
Dr. Schwartz. Okay. Dr. Schwartz was my shrink once I was at Langley Porter. And he was the person who supposedly took care of me, wrote my prescriptions, saw that I took my medication, was responsible for writing up the records. One night we were coming back from a therapy session, walking down the corridor, just before entering the ward. And a young man came running towards us. He was agitated, frantic, frenzied, excited. He was carrying the receiver end of the wall telephone in his hand. He had jerked it off the wall. And he began to shout when he saw Dr. Schwartz. He said, "The president has been shot. The president is dead. The president has been killed." And Dr. Schwartz turned to me and he said, "Don't pay any attention to him. He's just hallucinating." And that was the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And you know, all these years I wanted to tell people where I was when Kennedy was shot. because you hear it all the time. People ask you, the man on the street asks you with his microphone, people at parties or in classrooms, they say, where were you when Kennedy was shot? And I was always so afraid somebody would ask me that, and I would have to say I was in a mental institution. Well, I was.
I was born into a family that really didn't want children. And my mother had a hard time with me. I was a colicky baby and cried a lot. My father was a very violent person and abused me, didn't like the fact that I cried, got me drunk to shut me up. My feelings around being a baby was nobody picked me up and nobody loved me and nobody fed me. And I don't think that that's like the entire truth, but I think it's how that baby saw the truth, that nobody wanted me, nobody wanted this baby. And when I was 7 months old, I learned how to walk. I had crawled down a flight of stairs, opened the front door, and walked out into the street. My mother was horrified and ran out and picked me up. That's when I knew I couldn't get away. And it's when I knew I had to stay. And the baby that walked out into the street that tried to run away just gave up and said, I can't do it. I can't stay here. And my perception of that is that another baby came. Then another baby said, okay, I'll be Katie, and I'll take your place, and you can go to sleep. And that's when I started seeing that creating other personalities was a way to get out of whatever problems I was having. I started with just 3, and the one that grew got to be 1.5 years old, and she was called Little Katie. And then when my brother was born, I made more, I created more. There was one that was called Honey, but her name really was Clara. Then there was Jean. She was about 4. Well, being a girl didn't work, so maybe being a boy would work. So we made a boy. There was a whole bunch of them that were like 6, 7, and 8. Janet and Joe and Kate. And Kate was the one, and Kathy. And Kate was the one who pretty much operated in the outside world. And it went on like that. And every traumatic event that happened in my life, I made more. And I made more people to take care of me, more people to be abused so that I wouldn't have to be abused.
I grew up as a middle-class Chinese person who had to deal with white people all the time. I didn't deal with them, in fact, in my childhood. And maybe I learned about what I shouldn't do, although I still would say today I'm not sure I've learned what I should do.
How is that possible in the city of San Francisco, that you didn't have to deal with white people?
Because they wouldn't deal with me.
How?
They wouldn't speak to me. I went to junior high school that was in this middle-class neighborhood. I still remember this one guy. I sit down in social studies or something, and turns over and he says, "You're Chinese and you're a commie." And I didn't know what he was talking about. I was put in the highest track with all these very upper middle class, mostly Jewish students. And it was just understood that I didn't exist. They'd have these little parties and their little society things, and never a question that, of course, I wasn't part of that set. You can't come into my house because you're Chinese. My mother won't let you in my house. I didn't have any friends. My last year in junior high, they bussed a busload of black kids in, and I still remember it was like the Martians were coming. I mean, no one was going to speak to these kids, but at least these kids had each other. I mean, I was supposed to be with the other bunch, right? Because I had lived out there. A black girl sat on the bench and a white girl had been sitting there at lunchtime. So then the white girl went and told the teacher that the black girl sat in her spot. We're talking bench on the playground. So the teacher went over and made the black girl move for taking the white girl's seat on the bench. It's why, when I went to Berkeley, right after the Third World Strike, it was like all this anger and all this hatred and everything that I felt. I hated white people. I hated white people. I mean, when I think about it now, it's sort of scary to me how much hate I really had. I remember growing up and just thinking the only thing I want to do is just get the hell out of this country. I just hated it. But then there was nowhere to go either.
My father was in the habit of going overseas and coming home and getting my mother pregnant and then going back overseas and basically leaving my mother with her insanity and his children to deal with, her loneliness and her insanity and his children. My brother and my sister took care of me, did most of the things that, you know, got me through the day. And we were extremely poor. My mother used to send us out going to garbage cans to find food. She had attempted suicide so many times that she got stuck in an institution. And since my father was overseas and she was institutionalized, I was put in an orphanage. My parents had a temporary reconciliation when I was 3 to get their children back together, immediately after which they separated because that was the plan, you know, they just wanted their children back. And my mother promptly married one of my father's drinking buddies who beat the shit out of everybody all the time, basically, and was a very extreme alcoholic with a horrible temper. He came home one day and had somehow decided that, in spite of the fact that I was only 4 years old, it was my fault that there was a large red lipstick 8 from one end of his car to the other. And because of this, I had to stand up in the corner until I couldn't stand up anymore. And then when I finally fell down, he put me out the back door and made me sleep on the pavement in the back. And told me that I had to do this because, with no blanket and no pillows, because I was a dog. And he did all sorts of lovely things like that. And in between which, apparently, well, not even apparently, he, I slept with him. And he did things that I still need to unravel to this day. But so, by which time I'm 3.5, maybe 4. And all I'm doing is going along and, you know, my stepfather wants to beat me up or he wants to have sex with me. I don't care, whatever. I don't know the difference. By the time I was 5, my father finally came and got his 3 children from his crazy wife.
Mama tells me that she had a cesarean. And her babies were born by cesareans, so I came through the world honest. I came through the world honest. And she actually says that I also came out fast. She tells me that most children, you hear that when babies are born, they're born with their eyes closed and you have to spank them and then they start crying. Well, Mama said when the doctor pulled me out, I was already looking around like this and and a little perturbed that someone had brought me out so abruptly. And she said, I've been that way ever since. So, you know, although I know cesarean sections are quite painful, and so I came in under the knife. I came in with my eyes open. Mama also said that as a baby, I had a hot behind. By that she means that whenever she would change my diaper, I enjoyed it and would giggle and laugh and, you know, and I was full of energy and was constantly kicking up my legs or, you know, how was I to know that girls aren't supposed to do that sort of thing? As a child, I could walk on the ceilings. I'd butterfly up on the walls, and I'd really have this sense of actually going up on the wall and then on the ceiling, walking, and a parent would come in and I'd say hello to them from the ceiling. I sang before I talked. I mean, it's an inheritance through our family. My dad is this incredible drummer. He's this drummer. I am a drummer's daughter, daughter of pounding, daughter of sound, of dancing. I am a child of music, child of movement, she who has learned to be quiet and still. I had to learn how to be still, you know. So I was always dancing and always being told, sit down. This thing of having, like, almost having a radio station inside your, or several radio stations inside your head.
What does that feel like?
Oh, it feels great. And then it slips out of your control. And when it starts to slip out of your, or what you think is your control, and when it gets to that point, it starts to get a little scary. It's tiresome to not be able to turn the radio station in your head off, you know?
I can imagine.
Really. It just goes on and on. It segues from waking reality right into the sleep and right back out again. It's like non-stop. And it's almost like you choose the appropriate point in your dream that coincides with what's going on around you to wake up. So they just sort of like they're edited together. It's really creepy. It's actually creepy.
So when all those things are going around in your head, what is on the outside?
I'm talking a lot. And at a certain point, I start to not become, I've been told, I start to not be easily comprehensible. I'm not incoherent, but it's hard to understand because things are moving so fast in my head that I'm starting to edit like a telegram. I started having these flashes about Bob Dylan. And I'd known for a long time that we were born on the same day. The central focus of these manic episodes is really about saving the world. And the first fantasy or hallucination about Dylan was that I was his soulmate and that Baez had not been equal to it, which is why it didn't work out. And it has a messianic Jesus thing to it too. That, you know, sometime or a couple of thousand years ago, there's this guy Jesus who tried to save the planet and it didn't work. And this time, it wasn't going to be a male figure. It was going to be a couple. It had to be a couple. Because it was just a male figure. It leaves half of the world out, namely us women. I decided the only thing I was really obsessed with in my life was Bob Dylan and my love for him. So I decided I was going to do a public love letter to Bob Dylan, and I did it. And this thing was actually on the 5 o'clock news on ABC, and I hope a lot of people saw it. Why am I in love with Bob Dylan? Why am I in love with somebody I don't know? It's a really good question. I wish I knew the answer. But I think doing this window was one of the ways of finding out the answer that all the feeling is still there, which is what gave me the courage to do this window. This public pronouncement of my passion. Cut!
I thought all mothers frightened their kids. My mother frightened me. She would crawl on all fours, snarling and growling, till I was backed into a corner. She was ferocious, and she growled at me until I would begin to cry.
My mother told me the story of Bluebeard and his wives, and how when the last and youngest wife opened the door and saw all the other wives dead, and then tried to close the door and lock it and wash the key, the blood from the key, she couldn't do it. These are the stories that my mother told me before I went to school. I was probably the only child in kindergarten who thought she knew that hair and fingernails continued to grow after you were buried in your grave. These horrid stories that frightened me so much taught me to think about the meaning of the story and to apply it to myself and to try to figure out what it is that a story is really saying. And what I learned about that was I learned about metaphor. And at a very early age, I learned that things stand for other things. That the bloody key stood for the fact that you can never go back again and you can never undo the things that you've done. For some people, religion is what keeps them going. For me, it's metaphor and how everything transcends what the reality of it is. You either go mad or you learn about metaphors.
Now I can say to you what I think I made up and what I thought was a hallucination, what it, felt like it came from outside me. I got a whole other idea of who I was. I thought my mother gave birth to me in the Warsaw Ghetto, which is not possible because I wasn't born yet. And then that my mother wasn't my mother and that I had a different set of parents. So I'd been born in the Warsaw Ghetto and I escaped through Siberia and then went to China and came to the United States from Shanghai over the Pacific Ocean and landed in California. Had been on the boat so long that I had like sea legs for a while. And, I made all this stuff up.
My father's goal, I think, although I don't think he ever would have been able to say this, but it was to have everybody depend on him and everybody take care of him, and that everything had to go through him in order to for anything to happen. It was starting from when I was about 12. You couldn't close any doors inside the house. You couldn't wear any clothing inside the house. You couldn't...
This applied to your mom too?
Yeah. You couldn't have any privacy of any kind there, and that was appalling for a 12-year-old girl. That was just not being able to close the door in the bathroom was, I thought I just was going to die. I didn't feel like I could have a life that my father didn't know about. I started a diary in 1971, November of 1971, that I still keep. And I'm very surprised I kept it because very early on my father started reading it. And no matter how well I hid it, he'd find it and he'd read it. And he'd write things in it to show me that he'd read it. To me, it's just boggling that I managed to keep going. But I know that I kept going because I was a multiple. Because the personality who stayed at home could cope with that. That's all she could do. She could cope with that kind of intrusive behavior. There was one of them who sort of had social life. That was Marie. And then there was the one who went home and coped with the abuse, and that was Louise. And I had a nervous breakdown because Mary came out at home, and my father abused her. And she didn't have this in her experience. And that's when the personality that was called Mari was created, was out of that confusion. And I came in to be at the very end of my junior year of high school and had absolutely not the foggiest idea what was going on, who I was or where I came from. Or I had this idea of who I was, but let me tell you, it's so far from what reality is. Sometimes when I thought I went to sleep, I didn't. I had one who, well, she was the first one of us to become a lesbian, and she had a lover, and I didn't know. One Christmas, a lot of them decided that they wanted to trade Christmas presents. This is when we had developed a lot of cooperation, and we lived in a very little apartment, though, and everybody was trying to buy Christmas presents and hide them without anybody else knowing what was going on. So the adults hid them really high up, and the kids hid them really low down. If you found something in a closet that wasn't yours, you left it alone. And actually it worked pretty well. We had tons of presents under the Christmas tree, and everybody got surprised.
Okay, the problem with this story is it sounds exactly like there are a lot of roommates.
No, okay.
So
it's not a lot of roommates. It was all me. It was all these 25 people inside of me who all wanted to give Christmas presents to one another.
My mother said that my first words were, "Shut that door." And I was taken away from her when I was 13 months old, so this had to be before I was 13 months old. I was already screaming, "Shut that door!" So you can imagine how I might have been by the time I was 13, you know. And so I was really quite unhappy, and had a lot of people around me telling me that I didn't have the right to be unhappy, and that I really wasn't unhappy, and the world was okay, right? And it wasn't. And I got more and more and more and more morbid until it just seemed the most extremely natural thing for me to do, to sit down in the corner of a room and turn off the lights and slice myself up. I took a knife and I put nice big deep cuts in my shoulders, and I just let the blood run down my arms because it was real. There was finally something nobody could argue with. You know, you could say, oh, maybe you don't feel like that, but you can't tell me I'm not sitting here with blood all over my arms, now can you? And I was totally starved for what I really needed when I was growing up. And what I got instead was attention for being cute, you know. I got, I got physically abused for being cute. I mean, and also I wound up having this fabulous body at the age of 13, at which time nothing anywhere had been said except for that sex is black and dirty and awful. And all of a sudden, everybody everywhere is responding to me. I go to live with my mom, and she turns out to be this dope-smoking hippie who's into an Eastern religion and sits and chants her mantras and says, you will take your clothes off, you will sit down in this meadow, and you will be free. Damn it. Okay, fine. Then I finally get away from her and I go back to live with my stepmother, by which time I have become her worst nightmare. She goes, I'm not going to discipline you anymore. I refuse to discipline you anymore. I said, fine, fine, Mom. And I was also getting great grades in school, you know. I was getting A's. I'd been getting tossed back and forth between my father and my mother often enough that I finally ran away from home. It was only for about 5 days, and it was only to make a point, which is that I might be your daughter, and I might be your daughter, and I might be 15, but I don't have to put up with this. You know, anything could happen, anything. So I had found out that I was pregnant, you know, I mean, because I'd had such fabulous counseling, because I was so incredibly stupid in the dark, had no idea how to handle myself sexually, and because I was eager to please people, and because I needed attention. If somebody wanted to have sex with me, they could. That was basically it. And plenty of people did want to have sex with me. So when I was 15, I had my first abortion, and I don't have a clue who the father was. It was the first year that abortion was legal. And I had it with no anesthetic because I was afraid that the anesthetic would send me over the edge. And which the doctor botched the abortion, and I had to go back because he was like so terrified of performing an abortion on this screaming teenager. I knew I couldn't live with my mother. My father's wife wouldn't let me live with them. And I just started rocking back and forth in this rocking chair, and the world went away. The world disappeared. It was the most peaceful place I've ever been in my life, ever. Just nothing mattered anymore. And that was the first time that I was ever put into the hospital. And I didn't talk for several days. And then eventually a nurse came into my room, and she tried to get me to take some Valium, and I crumbled them up and I put them on the floor, and so she said she was going to get a syringe and put them into me intravenously. And I said, get out of my room, bitch! And my father found a group home in San Francisco, the big city, ooh. I said, no, Dad, I don't think I want to go. And my father said, I'm sorry, honey, but that's what's going to happen. And I couldn't believe it. I mean, you know, things had been off the wall enough, you know. They had been strange enough, but here was me being straightforward, going, "Dad, don't do this to me." And he's going, "I'm sorry, honey. It's going to happen anyway." So I yanked the drawer out of the desk in my room and I started pounding it against the window. There were 3 people holding me down, and I had never felt so good before in my life. I felt like a kid throwing a fit, and I felt like I needed to be that kid in a big way, and it just felt really good to be able to throw that fit and have those people hold me down. And not punish me for it, not be mad at me for it, you know. And then I was off to the group home.
When Sigmund Freud's female clients told him they had been sexually abused in childhood, he said these were fantasies. Why didn't you believe us?
When the woman awoke from a dream, she thought she had lost her daughter in the basement.
I have these dreams because I was molested in the basement when I was 5 years old. He took off each piece of my clothes until I stood on the chair without anything. Cobwebs don't have spiders, he said. I'll cut off your head if you tell anybody. And I looked out the window and I saw that faces were walking by.
My father was on drugs, and he was also part of a group of men who were pedophiles. And these people believed that it was very important for children to have sexual experiences before they were 8 years old. In order to survive as a child, you have to forget. You can't go to a ritual or be raped by your father and then go to 5th grade the next day and have everything be okay. When traumatic events happen over a period of time, the child, and I certainly, developed ways of not remembering very quickly. The way that I developed was by creating other personalities that remembered for whoever was going to school. In the process of remembering, I felt it was a process of the personalities who had all of the knowledge sharing it with me, but for people who aren't multiples, it's just a process of remembering something that was too traumatic to deal with when you were a child.
My childhood was mutilated. I didn't have a childhood. I never was a little tiny Susan. One of the last vestiges of immense anger that I have left inside of me is that I was totally robbed of any innocence. My innocence just got completely ripped off. Totally ripped off. And that's one of the worst things you can do to a kid. It's one of the most horrible things you can do to a kid. Is not allow them to be innocent. And a lot of things still happen to me today that are as a result of not ever having been allowed to be innocent. And those are some of the things that I value the most in this treacherous world, is for the opportunity to be innocent in a complex, strange place, the opportunity to just be innocent.
I was a member of a Marxist-Leninist organization. I had spent all of my adult life involved in radical politics. What I did for work, who I lived with, what I did in my life was not determined by me. I mean, I did what I was told to do. Chinese Progressive Association started coming out once again in support of China and pushing for normalization of relations. A lot of people really wanted to put out this image of the victimized Asian. That Asians are passive, are afraid to speak out, are trained and told and brought up to not make trouble. I felt that Chinese were fighters, that they were fighters and they always have been. We got involved in the I Hotel in Chinatown. I had a breakdown in 1980 when I had symptoms that my doctor decided meant that I was psychotic and that I wasn't going to be able to continue to be functional in my life. Immediately what happened was I got thrown out of this organization. Now when you join a Marxist organization, it's a commitment. It's a commitment for life. That's why you turn everything over. And there I was, with no career, not a penny to my name. Really, nothing. It's 1980. It's Reagan years. I can write a resume saying, "Ex-communist madwoman, will you hire me?" Every time I opened the front door, the world was warped, like in a funhouse. And everything was dark, always dark. And all these women's faces were in the ocean, saying, "Help me, help me." They were mocking faces, laughing. I would listen to the opera, and I was like in another world, floating out wherever the highest and deepest notes in the opera were going. I was like gliding. I saw an Asian woman with the hair coming out, white hair sort of sticking up, standing at the shore. And maybe this past 8 years has been about trying to find that image and make it alive. I think it was the Thorazine and the antidepressants that killed that really kills the hope. I mean, I really think the Thorazine creates despair. I felt suicidal most of my life. But I think that's different than the sense of not even enough energy to give a shit. I think I was trying to get out of my life. I think my life wasn't working for me. That years and years and years of being pretty alienated, being very repressed, having created an inner world for myself, an emotional world, not having the opportunity. And that came about as a result of a lot of things. Society, my family, just my personality, I mean everything. And then being all that alienated, it all builds up. I think all my emotions are coming out and hitting me on the head and bringing my world down and saying, we can't live here anymore.
Depression is not about pain. Depression is about the absence of pain and the absence of feeling. When I began to get depressed in 1963, I noticed it because I was no longer worried or anxious about my children. I couldn't feel anything. If I drank a cup of coffee, it didn't lift me up. If I went to a party, it didn't make me feel better. If I read poetry, it didn't save my soul as it had done in the past. There was absolutely no feeling, nothing, nada. No feeling is what depression is about. And it put a barrier between me and my children, my husband, my friends. I didn't care if I slept well. As a matter of fact, I slept most of the time. I would stand and prepare a meal and look at my hands cutting the food as though they weren't my hands, as though they were not attached to my body. Depression is not about pain, it's about everything gone away.
I was seeing a doctor, and the first thing he prescribed for me was Stelazine, which is a strong tranquilizer. Seems to me a strange thing to give someone who is depressed. I got very frightened. I started going to sleep at night with the car keys under my pillow so that if I had to rush the baby to the hospital, I could do it. Somebody was going to fall. Somebody was going to be hurt. Somebody was going to die. So the doctor increased the medication, and it was like a downward spiral. So I committed myself to San Francisco General Hospital.
Just before being admitted to the ward, I was asked to remove all my clothes, put a little paper across me, and wait for the doctor to come in. When he entered the room, I remember that he stood somewhat behind me and asked me my medical history. I told him that I was depressed, and I told him that I was afraid that I might hurt my children and myself. And then he suddenly asked me if I'd like to kiss my husband's penis. I felt terribly embarrassed, and I knew that if I said no, that he might think that I was there because I was not able to respond and not a sexual person, and that in some way I was cold. I thought if I said yes, that he would think that I was bad, that he would think that I might be a nymphomaniac, that he would think I was a whore. For 25 years, I've wondered why he asked me that, and what he got out of it, and what, if he had any idea what a question like that does to a woman sitting on a table with a strange man in a brightly lit room with no clothes on.
Life on Ward 92 was really a nightmare. My clothes were taken away, and I felt lost like an orphan. It was so crowded that where there were corridors for people to walk, beds had been put there so that you had to go sideways. Somebody stole my bathrobe. A woman walked through the door wearing my bedroom slippers.
And it really was a war.
The doctors were shut off in a glass-enclosed area. All the depressed people sort of huddled at one end of the room. And the manic people ran around frightening everybody to death. They were acting parts of their lives that they had once lived through, or that they could not live through. In 1274, the first asylum was opened in England, and it was called Bethlehem Asylum. That's where the word Bedlam came from. Bethlehem was famous for the lunatics' ball, and all through the ages, people in asylums had dances, and they got dressed up, and they wore fancy clothes, and they went wild.
There was not medication in those days, and so those dances must have been something. Well, Langley Porter had its equivalent, and I would say it would be called the Thorazine dance, because we were like a bunch of zombies shuffling around to music from the 50s. So I danced with Dr. Schwartz, and it was like a prom. We tried to pretend, I guess, like we weren't the patient and doctor, but there's just no way that you could go to a prom on Thorazine and dance with your shrink and think you were someplace else.
I'm attending Stanford Law School. I'm the first in the family to go to law school. Stanford is one of the top law schools in the country. And sometimes when things got too intense for me, I would dip into one of the stairwells and sing. Down in Egypt, land, tell old Pharaoh. So I would like sing this song, and I know it's reverberating through the school. Let quietly come out and go to class. I lived in the law student dorm that first year. I heard what those boys talked about, these boys who were the sons of the senators and the judges, and I heard their conversation. I saw them at pub night, and it made me afraid. I said, this is the ruling class? Oh boy, are we in trouble. There were 5 black people in my class and 15 women, and this was in a class of about 139. And my experiences there were challenging. So I took a leave of absence and I moved to a intentional community. And it was a place that has hot springs, natural hot springs. And I'd seen the residents float each other on this wonderful warm water. And one of the men living there asked me if I wanted to float. It was night and the stars were out, so I said yes, quite innocently. And as he floated me, I felt him get an erection. And I turned to him and I said, I am not at all interested in having any kind of sexual relations with you. And he assured me that everything was fine, not to worry. There was no way that he would be able to penetrate me anyway in warm water. And I mean, he just fed me all these lines, and he was calling me goddess. And then he turned around and rammed me down on him and came immediately. And I got out of the water and dried off. And I said to life that if this is what I could expect of my species, that I need another reason to stay here. So my rage, once it came out not only at him, but at the whole misuse, ignorance, repression. Sex is dirty. Our very bodies are dirty. It was rage at that whole matrix of miseducation and the violence that got expressed through his actions. And also after him, I left my body. I left my body. It was spring equinox. So here spring returns, and the goddess grabbers take what they want. But I danced in the woods. Sometimes a man would happen upon me in the woods. If he made sexual overtures, I left my body. I couldn't live in the same body where sexual energy or attraction or activity also lived at the same time. Couldn't do it. I was a wise fool. I would just spread my blanket in the woods and go to sleep, and there were wild animals in the woods. Maybe I tasted nasty to the other things that tasted before I awakened. They said, no, not this one. The creative force was full-blown then, because I'd taken the lid off. And when I saw the bottom falling out, I became a bag lady. It was as though all my boundaries had melted away. I carried one change of clothes. I had a musical instrument, which was like a small harp. I spent a lot of time in the San Francisco airport. One of the cleaning women there really took me under her wing. And the first night that I slept there, she looked at me and she said, "Baby, you all right?" I had a sense that if I really needed help, that one of these church mamas would materialize. I would enter into one of these ecstasies, and I would just let the music that I hear in my mind out. I got on the bus one day, and an older black woman came up and she said to me, "Girl, why don't you have on shoes?" And I said, "I don't have shoes." That's when I called my friend from law school and said, "You know, I really need to get home." I had gone home. This was after I had earned my way home. And my family had gone out to a candlelight service for New Year's Eve. This was 1982. They invited me, and I couldn't imagine going to church where I had learned about all this God, He, and the blonde God and blonde Jesus with the blue eyes, and what did that have to do with me? And that was part of the damage, so I said no thanks. So there I was, being the girl, washing the dishes on New Year's Eve in my mother's house. I'm 25, and I'm thinking, is this what I have to look forward to in life, to end up back here? And if so, then why not use these knives? I considered slitting my wrists. And so I said, well, why shouldn't I? And that's when, you know, this music came thundering through.
Oh, one of the things I didn't mention about the manic episodes is that you spend money like there was no tomorrow. It's so wonderful. One could technically say that I had bought out the flower store, and I filled the bathtub with flowers. I was dancing on the roof and taking moon baths. And they thought I was a danger to myself, which I really never was. So my sister asked me then if I was willing to be hospitalized, and I said yes, as long as I wasn't given any drugs. I was just trying to be as good-natured about all this as I possibly could. I mean, as cooperative as I think I was probably wearing my Romanian peasant blouse or something. That was my favorite flip-out clothes, you know. I just climbed into the ambulance. There was no problem, you know, and this guy sat down next to me, and he started making a pass at me. I just said, look, you know, you're very nice and all that, but I'm in love with somebody else, which was absolutely true. I was in love with Bob Dylan. And we got to San Francisco and the Mission Health Center, and they turned around and sent me back to Highland. This guy was a mean son of a bitch, and he was by himself, and he handcuffed me. If he had explained it, I mean, these people are so stupid. They think if you're crazy, you don't understand anything, which is just like the dumbest thing in the whole world. It doesn't work that way. I mean, most of us might understand something, and it's really worth a try. I really was obviously not violent. He yanked my arms behind me and handcuffed me, and it hurt. Luckily, I mean, it was just a quick drive over the bridge, and I was back in Highland. And Highland again rejected me and sent me to Napa. And I didn't get to Napa until after midnight. Here I am flipping out with this manic episode. I hadn't eaten. I was starving. When I got to Napa, why didn't they ask me if I was hungry, you know? No. They took my purse away from me. They dumped all the contents out on the table. Then they gave me a very worn flannel nightie that reminded me of Mary Poppins. But there were all these strangers in the room. They expected me to get undressed in front of all these people I didn't know. I thought that was just unbelievable. But I remembered Mary Poppins, how she did it, which is to pull the nightie over the head and let it slide out and get undressed underneath. So that's what I did. And then they pounced on me and tried to tie me down to this bed. And I fought like a hellcat. I just kicked and scratched and screamed. And then they shot me up with what I assume was Thorazine. And it did absolutely, again, absolutely nothing. I screamed for the rest of the night. And then sometime in the early morning hours, they gave me something to drink. And I don't know what it was. I drank that and I slept. Long before you ever have a manic episode is a lot of, powerful illusions. And that time is like infinite, and there's just all this time to do stuff, and you just never, I never thought I would ever get to be 44 and a half. I'm surprised that I'm here, But that's the dreamer who just lets time slip through their fingers and doesn't do very much with it. I remember during the Hungarian Revolution when we lived in Vienna and hearing the kids when they took over Budapest radio. And I also knew that the kids my age were throwing themselves under Russian tanks with Molotov cocktails. And they were doing something very grown up, which is giving up their lives, which is something children don't usually do. And I think I felt terribly guilty for being in my warm house in Vienna when all these people were out there in the cold doing these brave, dangerous things.
How would you have been as a son instead of a daughter?
As the firstborn child in a Jewish family, I was the son, even if I was the daughter. And even if my father didn't want any sons, which he didn't, and he was delighted to only have daughters, it didn't make any difference. I was the son. So that was very interesting. And what would I have done if I had been the son instead of daughter? Well, I would have been Bob Dylan. I would love to be a rock and roll star. My friend said to me, "Gee, Hannah, we think your obsession with Dylan is not because you love him, but because you want to be him," which I thought was an interesting insight. I heard Naomi Newman on the radio one day, and she was talking about being a Jewish woman in America. And I was washing the dishes and listening to this, and I just started to sob. And I had never realized what a hard time I had with it. For my generation, the tradition of the Jewish man being rejecting of the Jewish woman, because of her openness and her aggressiveness and her sensuality, I think being Jewish is really hard, period. And being a woman is also hard. So being a Jewish woman is doubly hard. And on top of it, being the child of people who escaped from Nazi Germany is an additional burden, especially in the area of intimacy. Part of the fear of intimacy is the fear of revealing. I mean, I'm perfectly charming for an evening, but try living with me, and then you'll see what it's really all about.
Well, I have two very strange mothers. I have two really, really odd mothers. It's a toss-up which one of them is stranger.
And they're both women.
And they're both women. And so I have problems with women to the degree that sometimes I have problems being one. Because the only way in which I know I'm actually female is that I have tits. Do you know what I'm saying? That's not what it's about, is it? I have this thing about costumes, and I have some wild things, and I turn heads, and I have a good time. This is the way I am most of the time. This is how I look. I'm just, regular. I keep my hair tied back. I wear baggy clothes. So when I switch myself into the mode of like wearing a dress, I feel like a man in drag. I really do. And I do because I know that what's underneath that dress is not what you think. Just like the guy in drag, right? I am not the feminine little thing that you think I'm going to be. No. I have this really deep voice, and almost nobody on the telephone can believe that they're talking to a woman. Nobody. Sometimes I have to sit there and convince people. I really, honest, I'm not a man. I have a tough time perceiving myself as a woman.
How I got locked up was I think a lot of things factored into, I'd been dieting really heavily for 3 months. I'd been drinking these sodas, these sugar-free saccharin sodas, and not eating. So the counselor thought that my problem was I wasn't sleeping with men. and that would make me better.
This was a man
This was a man counselor who felt me up and told me what nice breasts I had and made me sick. He had a lot of power. He ended up getting in deep trouble for molesting his women clients. He was afraid I was going to kill myself or squeal on him, I think, one or the other. So he drugged me up pretty heavily. And after I got drugged, I started hallucinating. And he had no idea about drugs anyway, but he could prescribe them by just calling up the university physician. He would just sign off all these drugs. He gave me Milleril to start with, and quite a bit of it. And then I got moved on to 600 milligrams of Thorazine with Prolixin, with Cogentin. He ended up lying to me. He told me he was having me committed, and then the paperwork was already, well, it wasn't. So I went, and under the false assumption that I was being committed against my will, when in actuality I found out later he didn't have diddly squat. He had no papers, no court, no nothing. I never questioned anything to him. I kind of thought he was a little weird with his sex stuff. But I also felt like, but he's got a PhD. And being working class and all that stuff, the fact that I was even getting a BA was going to be a big, big deal. So, because both my parents didn't graduate high school, so it was like people that had PhDs were really smart. And later I got furious at him after I got incarcerated. Our day went like this. We'd get waked up at 7:30 in the morning. We'd go into the day room at 8 o'clock. We'd get our breakfast. We'd wait around and drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes until 10. There was a shock room that was right by the kitchen, and I remember if somebody was getting cooked, the lights would kind of dim. They were very uncomfortable with my sexuality, for one thing, but everybody else in there was having these horrible relationships with their men that it didn't make sense to me why they were saying all that stuff. I knew if I cried in front of the staff, I'd be shot up with more dope, and I knew if I got really angry, I'd get in trouble. It was like, it's the last place in the world to act weird in. Everyone that saw me gave me a different diagnosis. I got schizoaffective schizophrenia, I got paranoid schizophrenia, I got multiple personality, I got manic depression. I got locked up quite a few more times. I think I probably would not have gotten locked up in the first place if I had a husband. I really liked women a lot, but it wasn't like I was going to act on anything. I asked my mother, I remember when I was a teenager, what a lesbian was, and she said, it's somebody who likes women and girls. So I thought I was one with that definition. And I wanted to be part of like the women's movement, but at that time, the women's movement didn't like lesbians at all. We were lavender herring, we were, you'll wreck everything. On the other hand, the lesbian movement didn't want me to say I was a mental patient. Okay, we have this whole history of being crazy. Do you have to talk about being in the nut house? So I felt real silenced, which is why I ended up being in the mental patient liberation movement.
I sat my mother down and I said to her, Mama, now I need to know the stories of the women in your family. So it was reclaiming that legacy, that magic. I am not weird, or if I am weird, I come from a line of weird women who have made their way in this world. When I came back to Stanford, whereas the first time that I came, I was convinced that the thing to do was to become a white boy. The second time that I came, I went and looked for everything black and female. And I went to the same counseling center that I'd gone to before. I got a Chicana Latino woman who was astounding. And she said, "Who are you really?" And I said, it just blurted out. I said, "I'm an artist." And I started sobbing, sobbing. And she said, "Stay right there." So that's the first time I put that label on it, sobbing. Then I started getting counseling around the sexual abuse, and that's when the rage came out. At one point, I had this vision of this being that was a cross between a fox and a wolf, and it was female, and she was red, and she had long teeth, and she was angry, and she had a long snout, and her blood dripped from her teeth, and I called her Red Woman. And it was that image that started coming up when I would feel this rage coming out. There would be this fury that would come over me, and I would just want to rip him apart with my teeth. And I felt like I had to rein that in, or else I would physically hurt him, and it meant shutting down sexually. One time I also rode the anger out rather than reining it in. And just a split second I asked Martin, "Is it okay if I ride this?" And he said, "Ride it." So I rode it to completion, and I did sink my teeth in his shoulder, and I instead of asking him for what I wanted, I just took it. I am a many-skinned mixed blood, daughter of mountains, of hot springs. Which one is my tribe? She who is 5 tribes in one. There are still things about colorism. There are still things about good hair and bad hair. There are still things that we're passing on that don't help. There's this whole geography of racial intimacy where I find out who you are, and then you either move closer in my life or further away, but your skin determines where you sit on the map without even knowing your name. And part of me thinks that's a shame, and part of me thinks that's the way it is. And I'm reckoning with that still, I'm really wrestling that.
By 1982, I was really bonkers. 1982 is the single worst year of my life. I was in jail twice. I was in the hospital 3 times. I was beat up. I went through 3 bad relationships. I was fired from 2 jobs. The world just rejected me on all levels. And in the course of the 3 years that I was seeing this man, this psychologist, I had started intravenously abusing drugs. And I was smart enough to figure out that something was seriously wrong. But he wasn't. I said, "Doctor, I don't feel too good. My arms are green from shooting dope, and I think something's wrong." And he says, "Oh, well, Susan, I've done everything I can do. I can try to recommend a psychiatrist if you want to take pills, I'm like, "Get me out of here!" I threw myself at the mercy of the city of San Francisco, and I walked into a clinic, and I said, "Please give me somebody to talk to." And they gave me this individual who invited me to go motorcycle riding with him on the back of his motorcycle. He showed me his diagnosis of me in a book, Actually, I've been told that's unprofessional, but at the time I was relieved because I thought, well, if they can write it down in a book, maybe they figured out how to cure it, Maybe they could do something about my mind. But it was very unprofessional of him. And one day, this guy called me up and said, "Sorry, Susan, hope you don't hate me, gotta go," and left, fell off the edge of the earth. A month after that, a certain person called me on the telephone, and he had a very funny accent, and he had a very funny name. His name was Shimshan Wigader. And he said that he was picking up the caseloads for this person who had taken off and dumped all these cases, just let them sit. And would I still like somebody to speak with? And I said, "Why, yes, I would." The single greatest thing that I got out of years of talking to Shimshon was that my mind started to work like a conversation between the two of us, you know. I would look at something I did, and sort of in my mind I would start playing Shimshon for myself. He sort of inserted himself in my mind. And he did piss me off, and I needed to be pissed off sometimes. And I needed to be confronted and challenged. I really didn't care about the rest of the world at that point. I decided that I had to pay attention to myself. And if anything made me feel good, I did it. And if I wanted something, I got it. It was the first time that I got glasses. I learned how to swim. I wanted to survive. I started going to Al-Anon, and there were all these people who had alcoholic parents just like I did. And all of a sudden I realized that I wasn't alone. And it was blindingly refreshing. It was blindingly uplifting. It was amazing to me that there was a room full of people that knew how I felt. They really liked me. I was a popular person. They valued what came out of my mouth. You want to know what I got out of therapy? You want to know the best thing about therapy? You want to know? I learned how to talk about what was going on. You know, it was always my intention. Somewhere in the back of my mind, some part of me was always screaming to do it, and therapy let me do it. It taught me how, when something's wrong, to talk about it. It amazes me when I look back on it that the first office I walked into, or when I first started talking to people, I was catatonic. I couldn't talk. I was put into a hospital because I couldn't talk. Me.
The common diagnosis is manic depression. What got me on the lithium then, when I was back down into the depression, was Quentin Bell's biography of Virginia Woolf, right? And I see her through her life go up and down and up and down. And then in 5 she was, or 62? I mean, so late in her life, she sticks the stones in her pockets and walks into the lake. And I said, aha! That's not happening to me. I am not going to kill myself unless I decide I want to do it. I'm not going to have these depressions make me do something against my will, because I don't feel like the depressions are me. I feel like I'm taken over by something. So fuck this shit. So that very day when I finished the book, I had a therapist appointment. When I went to see him, I said, okay, I'll take the lithium, you know, fine, which he had offered to me when I was high. And I took a lithium in the office, and I took a bunch home with me, and when I got back to the house, I sat down on the couch, I fell asleep. I was so depressed, everything was great. And when I woke up from the nap, there was like a little spot of blue in the sky. I mean, really not very much, but just enough to know that the lithium worked. And I'd realized that each depression, the thoughts of suicide were growing. And then, of course, that I continued in my life to have these kinds of depressions, then eventually I could end up like Virginia Woolf and walk into the lake with the stones in my pocket, which I didn't want to do. The thing that's hard about it is that I do believe in these non-ordinary realities. There's something trying to emerge. And it feels intensely alive, which is why it's so hard to give up. And it's so imaginative. It has been my dream since I was a little kid of this great, passionate love. And that I have not had this in my life, ever. It's just like, it's the tragedy of my life, really. But I've wanted it since I was a small child, you know. And I have fell for the romantic ideal lock, stock, and barrel. I really believe that there is such a thing as a soulmate. May there not be one soulmate, but there are soulmates out there, and some people get to be with them. And I thought that I was going to be one of them. And I guess won't know till I die whether I got to be one of them or not, but so far it's been awfully lonely. I'm so deprived, you know. I'm like a deprived animal. I'm deprived just even of touch. But spiritually also, it's devastating. I can't imagine living like this for the rest of my life. If I knew that I would definitely end it. But luckily, I'm not one of those people who can see my own future, so I'll just continue bumbling along and we'll see what happens.
Can you say what you love about yourself?
Well, I have the premenstrual blues, so this week I'm really stuck in this, what have you done with your life? Nothing, 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 you know? The self-hatred wells up when I'm looking at me from inside myself, but when I look at me from outside myself, I like myself a lot. I think if I met myself, I would like myself a lot. Well, I think it's so hard to hear the I'm, and then immediately I don't like the sound of that. But as a being, I think as a being, I'm sunny, loving, generous, graceful. I love beauty, and I love just spreading it around.
I said to my therapist, I said, I think that there's somebody named Bridget who wants to talk. And she said, what do you mean? And I said, well, I feel like that there's somebody there who says her name is Bridget and she wants to talk. And she says, well, how did we get her to come out? And I said, I don't know. She says, well, let's try this technique. And she put a chair beside me. And she says, move into that chair. When you move into that chair, you'll be Bridget. And I did, and I didn't remember anything from that point to when I moved back. And she said, do you remember anything? And I said, no. And she told me a little bit about this person who called herself Bridget, who was Catholic and wanted to be a nun, and which was very appalling to me. And she said, do you understand what's going on? And I said, no, I don't. And she says, well, I want to, think about it. I want to try to figure it out. And I said, I want to try to figure it out too. I devised a system of talking to them that I called mapping. This actually has been taken into the psychiatric community. I now read about it in books. One of the ways of mapping was just to figure out who was there. So who knew who? Who do you know? What do you know about them? Another thing that I did was what I called talking in the dark, which was just talking to the people and telling them that it was safe. When I was going through my recovery process, all of the fear that I didn't allow myself to feel as a child came roaring to the surface, and I was terribly afraid all the time. I was sure my father and all the other men who abused me were going to come get me. I was positive. Never mind that I didn't have the same name, I lived in a different city, that probably half of them were dead because they were old men when they were abusing me. I was so scared that I couldn't turn my lights off at home. I lived on the 3rd floor of an apartment building, but I was sure that somebody was going to come get me. There was already a deadlock bolt on the door, but I installed 2 more because I was so scared. And I went to sleep with every light in the house on. I never turned them off. I didn't want to integrate. Integrate meant that somebody was going to die. I didn't want to integrate. I did not want to integrate. I couldn't imagine. They were all separate people. How could we be one person? Different personalities actually seem to come from different parts of your brain. So that when you integrate, your brain actually sort of reconfigures itself to connect all of those areas that weren't connected before. Different personalities who were old enough would have different menstrual cycles. The little kids didn't have any at all. So when I integrated, my menstrual cycle went haywire. Some of them didn't wear glasses and some of them did. And once I integrated, my eye prescription changed for the better.
I'm a child, it's hard to keep growing when your world is gone insane. I'm a child that lies in my...
One of the most important things for me in my healing was my spirituality. So when I light my candles, the image of the goddess I see is myself in a mirror. So I see the divinity within myself. I love the fact that I'm pretty, and I love the fact that I'm a lesbian. And I really love the fact that I'm a good librarian. I love the music I create, but mostly I just really love my spirit.
When I went into Langley Porter and I was seeing Dr. Schwartz, I obeyed the things he said. I thought that he was there to get me well and to get me home, and I would do whatever that entailed, what was needed to do that. So he began to give me assignments, and the first assignment he gave me was that I could go home on the weekend if I would bake a turkey. So I went home on the weekend and I baked a turkey. The second week, the assignment was I could go home if I would mop all the floors in my house. I went home and I mopped all the floors in my house. And I thought to myself all this time, maybe I'm getting better. This is making me better. One of the things that I wanted to do very much, and I would say this to Dr. Schwartz, was I want to go to school. I want to be something. I want to make something of my life. I need something of my own. No one in my family had ever completed college. I would be the first person to do that. And he said to me, if you can't stay home and take care of your children, then go and get a job. Don't waste everyone's time by going to school. I would like to say this to you, Dr. Schwartz. I went to school. I got an education. I spent 10 and 11 years teaching in college. I became a filmmaker. And now I'm making this film. And I did, in the long run, get a job and go to work. Well, once you've baked a turkey.
Thorazine. And actually, this is the joke, because I have a long history of problems with school. Because I was on the Thorazine, I ended up having this really high GPA. And now I look at it and I think, well, if I hadn't been on the Thorazine, I would have had, my GPA would be much lower because I'd be my normal opinion in itself. I still remember my last phone call with my therapist, and I was anxious and a mess. And he said, well, I would up the dose of the Thorazine, and I can't see you until Tuesday. It was like Thursday. Do you know how long that is when you're in that state? Forever. That's when I put down the phone and I stopped taking the Thorazine. Called Lanny Porter and hassled with them a little bit, and finally somebody listened to me and gave me this number of this woman, and I called her up, and she said, you sound pretty desperate, you're coming today. If somebody hadn't listened to me then, I'm quite sure that I wouldn't be sitting here now, because I wouldn't have known where else to turn. So that's a major, major thing that began to make things better. A therapist who was a human being. She said, well, I don't think you're schizophrenic. She said, but I think you question your own sense of reality. Somehow I think that inner me, that death person walking around, was saying, I want to be alive now.
On February 26, 1991, Karen Wong was raped and murdered in her apartment in San Francisco. Her slayer has never been found. I think about Karen all the time, and I say to myself over and over, who did this? Who did this? The day before her funeral, rain falls, breaking a 3-year drought. In the months since her murder, my dreams of her are fraught with fear. I am driving down a hill at night, and Karen is standing at a bus stop. I know she is in danger. I stop my car. Get in, Karen. I'll drive you home.
All of us put boundaries around us of how we can cope, and as we make those boundaries bigger, as our fear goes away, we can make those boundaries bigger and bigger. And I think all of us would have what's called visions, and all of us would be really in touch with the earth and hear the ground breathe. I really wish I was a fish sometimes. I would love to be a fish. I love the ocean, the immense power of the water. When I was a little girl, I entered the sea in my fantasy, and I was a mermaid who could breathe underwater. I had the idea of walking into the ocean, and I thought of a suitcase. If I'm going on a trip, I'd better pack. I started walking to search for Sappho. Part of looking for Sappho is looking for ourselves.
Oh, that's perfect.
That was perfect. And we got a bird.
Okay, Dee Dee, when you get about this far from her, just stop. And then she's going to hold on you for a beat or two, and then she's going to turn off. I'm sorry, I forgot to tell you that. I told everybody but Dee Dee.
You've got speed.
Action.
Sort of full, and as she comes by, I'm like on here.
Cut.